Hello, welcome. My name's Bridie and you'll be joining me, listening along as I talk through my final case study for a 300-hour yoga training that I'm completing with Jules Mitchell. For my case study, I worked with a 29-year-old female who had, we'll call it chronic pelvic girdle pain. The length of the time that she's experienced the pain for is about 18 months before we started working together. She is currently a student in her master's program and also a part-time nanny. So the focus is around this idea of pelvic girdle pain. And to begin working with my client, I just did a little dive into some of the research, some of the information that's out there around pelvic girdle pain. Two papers in particular that I looked at and drew inspiration from is a 2007 paper by O'Sullivan and Beals. There's actually in my research, I found a 2020 paper by the same authors. I could only find the abstract for that though, but it seems like these papers are an evolution of the conversation that we're having around how we manage pelvic girdle pain in a biopsychosocial model. The 2007 paper, in terms of the hierarchy, it's an article, it's an editorial, it's an expert opinion. So in terms of the evidence hierarchy, it sits relatively low because there is a high chance of bias. But nonetheless, it's very useful to hear a clinical lens talking to clinicians about how we, in the field of helping others, can have a broader, more inclusive model of how we think about pelvic girdle pain. So she began feeling the pain when she was running. She was running in a new environment, having recently moved to a very hilly city. She was doing her running for that she's run for a long time, but she was newly running up hills, and this is where she sort of credits and points towards the pain starting is her running maybe about half an hour or so on a regular run, but doing it up hills, and this is when she maybe started to feel the pain. This pain in her left SI joint also started to then bleed into her daily life, and her yoga practice became affected. She linked this to physical activity, but again, it's sort of, it's a bit vague on when it started, when it transitioned to becoming something that she experienced every day on the regular, and became part of her, the way that she saw herself, or part of her life, this pain experience. So after a while, without getting any better, she started to seek treatment from health professionals. The lists of people that she saw were an osteopath for a wee while, a chiropractor for a wee while, and a physio for a wee while. None of these she was seeing interchangeably with each other, so she would see a health professional and then wouldn't feel that it was beneficial for her, and so she'd move on. So she never saw two helpers at the same time. And this was her experience of things would, she'd give it a go, she might have a little bit of change with the treatment, but ultimately nothing really stuck. And what we see this in the research as well is that manual and manipulation interventions can have a short-term pain modulation or changing effect, but there's very little evidence to say that these kind of passive techniques that you might receive from an osteo, manipulations from a chiro, or in my client's case it was also dry needling from the physio, little evidence to say that they are useful long-term. the beliefs of the clinician become the beliefs of the client. And this is very present in my client's pain story up into us working together. So the general messages that she had heard from her healthcare providers was that she had a weak core, weak glutes, and that the way that she would get out of pain is by getting these areas stronger. She needed to be stronger. And there's a sub-narrative here around the pelvis being unstable, the fragility and the movement dysfunction that can live around this area. And when I come back to this article by O'Sullivan and Beals, they really clearly spell out just how innately stable the pelvis is. We have evolved to be efficient in our movement, and the joints, especially the SI joints on the back, they are well prepared for the general load, the general transmission of force that we would encounter in all of our regular movements. This is running included. So while we might get irritated in this area, what we don't want to feed into is the idea that the structure itself has a compromisation that will affect the pelvis in a way that makes it wildly shift out of place, makes it wonky, makes it problematic to do weight, to do movement, to be in this world. So the pain modulation, or the pain that's induced and maintained, can be partly because of the peripheral stuff, so the stuff in the tissue. So it's not to say that it's totally excluding it, but there's also a centrally mediated component, and so we start to talk directly to the nervous system, as well as what I might just point to in this case as well is sex hormones in the pelvic girdle pain phenomenon can have a relationship. And so worth pointing to my client also experiencing painful regular menstrual cycles, as well as headaches. And both of these things do plague her as well in this pelvic girdle, left side, SI joint pain, etc. When we did our work with Marcia around the physiology of the systems, the endocrine system did come up as a particularly gets kicked off in times of stress and can sort of trigger a cascade of symptoms and hormonal issues. And so it might be worth really mentioning that at this phase, when the pain sort of kicked off for the client, when she'd moved and was running up hills in a new area, this was actually a really uncertain time for her. It was at the beginning of COVID, and she was moving, traveling internationally. Her whole life got shaken up, and she found herself in a new place, really unsettled on exactly what the next life was going to look like. So it was a real sharp change for her. And I think there's space here to point towards this stress as well. It's also part of the painful experience. So now we're working together and we're starting to have a conversation, and the most important thing I think that I was able to provide this client is just a fresh narrative. So when my client came to me, the goal that we discussed was to establish a yoga practice that's nourishing and that feels that it's supporting her to be in less pain while she's moving. So that was her goal. And as we started to just sort of explore movement, my observation was very, very clear that she wasn't weak, that she had the ability to move well, she had the ability to refine and change things. So nothing sort of yelled and screamed at me that there was any need to keep perpetuating this weakness, instability, get stronger, you'll get more stable narrative. Because my real felt sense of her is that she is stable and she is strong, and that there can be this chance to shift the narrative in a more positive direction. So the education piece that I focused on with my client was first and foremost that the doing is the fixing. And there's a nice narrative around this in Greg Lehman's book, Recovery Strategies, on page 62. So I gave her that as a handout, and it's really just speaking to the engagement in doing things that you enjoy are powerful. And you don't have to feel pain-free to resume your meaningful activities. So in terms of like debunking myths, the myth that my client had is that she wasn't safe to move. And this myth is relatively easy to debunk for my client because she's searching for a better narrative and one that fits her perspective more. So she's been told by clinicians, and you know, she sort of felt it in her body that she is unstable. But the narrative that she's strong, me demonstrating what I'm looking for in strength, and then her being able to also succeed in the same skills, is the narrative that she's looking for. So we did do debunking, but nothing was sticky for her, so she's very happy to sort of just soak up the information that I'm giving. So very much in terms of the debunking handbook, all I needed to do was provide the accurate information that was in contrast to her beliefs. And that was sort of all that was needed. There's a nice flow chart of that on page 8 in that book. So that was kind of what I looked at. But there's nothing sticky that we needed to sort of butt heads against. She's very open to viewing my side of the coin. So then we move into what did we do together? How did we build and experience this narrative of, oh, you're strong, you're good, feel it. The first thing we started with was a breathing practice. So we focused here on the double exhale. She's supine but bolstered in a flex position. So there's feet on, supporting with heels, being able to engage and press down. And this is really just all about getting the pelvic floor moving up into its concentric phase. So making that excursion of the pelvic floor delicious and delightful. And this practice we sort of played with in other poses as well. Our somatic practice was the pelvic clock. So again, we just were supine, took out the props, and then the inquiry is just around the tilting of the pelvis. It was the sort of 9 to 3 phase that's missing. So we also then pulled that information into some of the active poses. So for our mobility work, we instead of mobility did a self-palpation. So this was from Shelley Prosco's work, as well as just a bit of like general chatter about the experience. So we palpated the bony landmarks of the pelvis, and then we moved through Shelley's warm-up of the cat and cow tilts of the pelvis with alternate leg positions. So we did the tabletops with internal rotation, external rotation, and just explored what they were like. So the active skills and the active poses, we started to work towards and explore the push and reach technique. So just began by pushing sort of in a chaturanga plank position on a bolster. So she's resting torso on bolster, pushing with hands and feet and reaching through the crown of the head, just to get a sense of the pelvis resting on the bolster and then being able to create enough tension, resistance and force to start to float the pelvis off. So that this is kind of the beginning of the skill of push and reach, but it was really more of a navel radiation quality. So it's just about feeling that she's able to engage from head to toe, all the limbs, feel strong but not be moving around too much. From there we did downward facing dog with a push and reach focus. So the bolster stayed, just pushed it forwards a bit, and if she had the space between her shoulders and head, she'd reach the crown of the head into the bolster. We put a block in between her thighs, and she sort of pushed down through the hands to reach the pelvis back. So that was sort of a space creating pose for her, and just felt again this idea of feeling strong. So we took that information of the 9 to 3 movement, missing a bit in the pelvic clock, and moved it into a lunge. And so here she's lunging with her heel driving down, pushing into the floor, and she's kind of reaching back up into the sitting bone with the front leg. And then just playing with the foot, the leg being the grounded stationary part of the joint, and it's the pelvis moving in this 9 to 3 position. So she had hands on hips for feedback there. We then took this lunge with keeping the skill on and just played with opening the lunge up into more of a warrior two. So she changes the rotation of the pelvis, she changes how the back leg's placed on the floor, and keeps the skill going. Final active pose, we just did an L sit. So from her warrior, she kind of started to ground again, long-legged sitting position, still heels pushing down, maybe blocks under the hands, but feeling grounded down into the pelvis. So she pushed the pelvis down and feel the reach through the crown of the head. Over time, this is just sort of explored to keep a sense of uprightness in the pose. The Shavasana we did was side lying with the affected left side on the top, so just a really comfortable position and a bit of hip flexion for her. Restorative poses, we worked our way through the seated meditation pose with the block on the back. She actually did meditation here as well, so she has a Vipassana background. So just looking at that container, that spectrum of meditation that we explored with Angela, we sort of flipped somewhere between concentrated focus and open awareness. So the Vipassana style has a bit more of an open monitoring vibe, but still there's this focus that we're pulling through around the breath and exploring exhales fully, or exploring exhales really clearly in the experience. So that's more of the concentrated focus, and the seated meditation was however long she wanted, maybe about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then she'd continue on with the rest of the restorative. After the seated meditation, a gentle back bend. This changed a little bit day to day, but she would go as small as just a rolled up towel under the spine. From the supported back bend, we took the active warrior 2 and just explored that in a restorative setting. So had a block underneath the bent front knee, ankle, and sometimes maybe a bit of weight on the front of the pelvis just to anchor down. Then the restorative poses moved into a forward fold, few different variations we played with, long legs and also a child's pose, and that would kind of go back and forth, which one worked. Both felt useful at times, just depended how much flexion really felt good in her back, how much stretch through her SI joint. Finally, the last restorative pose is an inversion. So really looking at propping up the pelvis, legs up the wall. Head is sort of the lowest part, but maybe a bit of support under the head. And then we went back to the side lying Shavasana. So quite early on in our first session, or discussing it in our second session, the compliance that my client showed was really uplifting. So she just felt that this yoga narrative, working with what's already good and just emphasizing that more, was just a better story for her as opposed to the unstable weakness paradigm. She could also feel quite early on that she did feel slightly better on the days that she did the practice versus days that she didn't, and so that's motivating at the beginning, and just kept her coming along to her practice. For measuring the outcome, I gave her the PEMS checklist. It's a well-being checklist. And what I liked about it actually is that it didn't record pain as a measure. Instead, it looked at the many sort of facets of her quality of life. And so we did a before and an after, and there were definite improvements, nothing like groundbreaking, but the narrative that we were able to explore together really gave her a sense more of inner peace. She felt a bit more self-love towards herself. A sense of trust. She was regularly enjoying exercise, and a bit more acceptance of her body type as well. So when we first did this checklist, I gave it to her, and this was also along with a discussion around the many factors that go into experiencing pain. So I used the narrative that we explored with Catherine in the hypermobility work about filling up the cup, and the more things that you enjoy, that you get value from, the more things that light you up, make your cup bigger, and thus you are able to have more tolerance in your system. I'm traditionally use the DIMS and SIMS model from the Noi group. And so we kind of bled both of these models together, but essentially just saying that everything matters, and the focus for the client needs to be on figuring out what the good things are, and trying to eliminate and then be prepared for the stressful things that she has to tolerate. Bit of homework separate to the active staff and the restorative staff. She did take those skills as well and explore them regularly, but also just a little bit of single leg standing. So this was kind of a warrior 3, but in the end it sort of turned more into a single leg squat. So just weight bearing on that single side to help build that capacity of the single hip. Also then we did just that little bit of home care around the lateral hip. So she popped herself into sort of an obers style position, and then just played with lifting the leg away. So I've explored that as an obers lift, but she played with lifting the leg in many different ways, but the key thing is that top leg's lifting. And then her final bit of homework was just more of a stretch. So she either explored a swan pigeon variation or a deer pose, and I sort of moved her in towards the deer category, just as there's a bit more space for her in her hips to explore that. The last time I checked in with her, she's actually back running regularly for about half an hour, so she's really moved herself out of her being scared of activity, and she's actually back running to what she was doing before her pain began. She also is experiencing less pain at the moment, and when we caught up, she's got a really beautiful narrative around it, and she's seen the many factors that are affecting her pain. So when we last spoke, she was also on holiday, she has a bit more stability in her life, and a kinder narrative to herself, and she's really seen how all of these things are affecting her daily experience, and she's experiencing less pain than she has in the last 18 months, which is awesome, but also just a bit more acceptance of self. So that is me. Thank you for listening and watching, and I hope there's something in there for you.